I guess don't say it, at least not too loudly. So I'll turn it over now to Vincent and/or Art to do the first presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. My name's Art Friedman, and Vincent and I will do a quick tag team. So before I start, I just wanted to read a couple quotes, if I could. One is from Gartner, and they predict that by 2020, 70% of enterprises will be using attribute-based access control, ABAC, as their dominant mechanism to protect critical assets, up from about 5% today. And so I've been working in this identity since about 2005. And about 2.5 years ago, I approached NIST about the idea of developing some guidance for attribute-based access control. And just in January, NIST published this special public 16162 on ABAC definition guidance. That was a great step forward. And the second quote I'd like to mention is from a wise man. If I can read the quote, funny. Neil John, I heard Neil John say that a little earlier today, and I thought that was kind of interesting. So for a lot of companies, particularly identity providers, that's your new money. So what we really want to talk about, slide Mary, what we really want to talk about is the topic of attribute assurance. Obviously, some of you must have an interest being here the last day in the afternoon. I know in certain parts of the federal government, we use our own best practices to implement ABAC. The problem that, my personal opinion, I think some of you might agree with me, the problem is that it's not standardized, these best practices. So for levels of assurance for authentication, we do have some guidance out there. It's recognized both in government and industry. But when it comes to attributes, there really isn't agreement. So, I can go in the federal government and I can go to some government agencies and they're using one set of best practices. I've talked to a few companies here this week and also back at the April meeting. They're using their own best practices. And so we really don't have consistent guidance that's out there. I think there's definitely a need for it. We really don't even have a recognized definition for attribute assurance, but apparently a lot of people can relate to that term. I was told that there's a conference going on in Europe related to this topic. So apparently there are a lot of folks, not just in the United States, but internationally, that recognize the importance of trusting the source of attributes, the accuracy, the integrity of attributes. At the last IDSG in April, there were about 20 folks. I presented a paper that was written jointly by NIST and NSA on this topic. I think overall there was agreement that we needed to pursue this topic. There were certain areas that weren't covered, like liability. There'll be a couple slides later that I don't think there's really complete agreement yet. Like Anil was saying, this is pretty early on what we're trying to accomplish. I know there's some vendors sitting here in the audience that sell products that provide ABAC capabilities, and there are also identity and attribute providers that verify to their relying parties and customers that the information is accurate. I think we would just want to have a higher degree of confidence in the type of information that's, our information, our PII that's being used. And I think this is an attempt to try to accomplish this, not only for the IDSG, but for the FICAM effort and other parts of the federal government. So what I'm going to do is, Vince, just this next slide about the scope.
Okay, actually, the attribute has been kind of defined in the Special Policy 800-162. So the purpose of this slide is to show the scope, what the attributes are being used by, two major technology we're interested in. So looking at the purple, the horizontal block there, that we define it as the ABAC, or access control. So what people call the authorization. So attribute in that domain of the world have three, category into three different kinds. One is called the subject attribute, and we have object attribute and the environment conditions. And so also look at the horizontal, the red box there. This is a identity, authentication management world. They might think the attribute is directly related to identity. So we kind of define it called identity attributes. So the identity attribute and subject attribute in our definition, they are pretty much is under the same category. It's just subject attribute has more than the identity attribute. For example, for local system, your process itself, it doesn't have to really connect to people. It's just a machine process, local process. So we call it subject attribute, which might not be identity attributes. Okay. But this might have some argument. People say that also is identity. But we like to keep the flexibility, so, leave this categorization in case people, they want to, put it into different categories. We have this provision for them to define their terms. So as we know that, when we talk about attribute assurance, we have to relate to the technology that we're going to apply them. So by looking at this slide, authorization and authentication, they are not totally exactly the same. And especially when you talk about authentication, there's identity, authentication mechanism, identity provider. So, there has some more extra than the authorization world. So, for the level of assurance, we also need to consider that. We try to develop a metrics or tool that, called the level of assurance. So we need to consider how they're being applied to identity world and the for authorization world.
All right, thank you. Mary, can you go to the next slide, please? And I'll go over this real quickly. So the paper that was written just introduces this concept of mapping assurance levels for attributes. So I know there are some folks out there that don't really agree with this approach. This was an idea that we had that was presented in the paper. I think some of you already have a copy of the paper. If you don't, you can let Vincent or I know, and we can have it emailed to you. So again, relating this to levels of assurance for authentication, a lot of folks around here, around the table, can relate to that. But again, when it comes to attributes and levels of attribute assurance or levels of confidence, we don't really have any kind of metric out there in government or private sector. That's what we're really pushing for, is to have some type of metric that, again, government and industry can use. So you as citizens, customers, relying parties, can have some type of concept of measures of confidence. So save questions for later. I'm done. You're done? Yes. Great. Keep us on schedule.
On time. Thank you, Art. So as Art brought up, as you see there, this attribute levels looks not coincidentally very much like identity levels of assurance, and there are some other opinions. Up next is Kim. Is she still? Yep, there she is. The OIX also has a take on this, on how to have trust in attributes, and Kim will, I think, address that or talk about that. Okay, Kim, thank you.
See, 2012 is the date here. There was actually an attribute exchange working group that one of the leaders actually is in the room, Dave Cox, and we wanted to be able to help have a marketplace and exchange amongst attribute providers, and have an easier way for relying parties and other individuals to be able to an attribute exchange environment. That caused a lot of different things. I was the chair of the business model working group. Okay, so I might need to get the person that goes next and just swap out presentations, because that's the thing I missed copy and send over.
wanted to... Okay. Bill? Okay, is that okay with you?
Yeah.
All right. This is Bill Fisher from the NIST National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence.
So yeah, thank you everybody for staying this late. I know it's been a long 3 days, and we're past the window of beating rush hour. So what I'd like to do today is, I know I only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to move kind of quickly through this, but I would like to give you a feel for what the center is and what the center does, and then talk a little bit about our attribute-based access control building block, which is a project the center has undertaken. And you'll notice the name itself is a bit of a misnomer, because unlike the 800-123 that goes into the authentication authorization. So I'll go right into about the center. So the center itself was stood up in June of 2012. It was after the discussion around the need for an executive order from the president addressing cybersecurity. Came about that Hill sort of realized that this is kind of but especially in the critical infrastructure case, all that critical infrastructure, at least 80 to 90% of it, is really owned by the private sector and not the public. So they set up a vector that would say instead of putting out standards and telling people what should be done, stand up an arm of NIST that can tell them how to do it. So I talk about the center as the operational arm of NIST. So we are all about collaborating and actually building architecture and design. So those three core goals. One is practical cybersecurity. I'll talk about it a little later, but anything we do is meant for industry, and our metric for success is adoptability. And so have solutions that are practical and easy to fit into a current architecture, either within that sector vertical or within the enterprise that's in our community of interest. We're not being effective in achieving our mission space. The second is increase the rate of adoption, specifically increase the rate of adoption of secure technology. We look for areas across the IT vendor community where there's problem sets that there may be really good technologies out there, but they're just not integrated in a way that they're easily adoptable. They're cost prohibitive. There might be some integration piece that no one's really just come together, a shim, some glue code. And so we try to be a free collaborative space that we can bring in vendors and address those integration needs and then put out a product that can be consumed more readily and adopted more readily. And the third part is increased innovation. So you'll see some of the topics we use for projects are sort of, the edge of the envelope type stuff. Obviously, the attribute-based access control, as Art just referenced from the Gartner, not a doesn't play a significant role in the access control space right now, but it's expected to grow. There's going to be a lot of challenges, and so we're trying to stay on the cusp of that, accelerate innovation.
Actually over there.
Oh.
That's
the mic. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
So if I could step up a little bit. So one of the things you'll hear, we have some basic tenets of center, and they are all centered around NIST tenets and also a lot of the tenets that we see being very applicable to actually getting our solutions adopted. And so obviously, as an entity that puts out a lot of very high regarded standards, any build that we do is standards. We want all of our builds to be modular so that they can very easily be integrated into an enterprise architecture. i.e., if we use a router in a build, but you have a Juniper router, you should be able to swap out parts one for one and implement. Repeatability is obviously very big. We actually produce a document, which will be an SP, a special public series. All the details in there so that an enterprise can read that architecture. With high-level ease, a lot of people call it the keep it simple, stupid method. We're talking about all the way down to, we might be even putting out podcasts to literally show you how we configure things, video podcasts, show you how we configure things so that you get a good feel for exactly our environment. Good to anybody that's not commercially available, so we work with a lot of IT security vendors, but when they come to it, we don't want their roadmap, make sure that they are bringing them something that's commercially available. Usability, a lot about that. IDSG has a core UX tenant. The center as well has a core usable. Teamed up with information access, try and make sure that any of our solutions include a considerable usability component. And then the open and transparency, as with all things we do at NIST, we participate in panels like the IDSG here. We look for lots of feedback. We post things to our website. So that fully follows this 4 tenets there.
Excuse me one moment, Bill.
Yeah, of course.
May I ask all those on the call if you could mute yourselves, please, until the speakers are done and then you wish to make a comment? Thank you. Go ahead.
So as I'll briefly run through this, as I touched on before, we seek problems that either where we can increase the adoption of secure technologies and or increase innovation. And we specifically have 2 types of projects that we work on. And the project that we talk about today, our attribute-based access control project, is a project that we call a building block. Sure, go ahead.
No, 5.
Oh, 5 minutes. Yeah. So we specifically are talking about a building block today centered around attribute-based access control. We do have another type of project that's called a use case, which is centered on sector-specific verticals. The building blocks, however, are focusing on problems that are agnostic to those verticals, as identity is in general, but attribute-based access control specifically, we see that as a foundational piece for a lot of our other verticals, and so we've designated that as a building block. I'll skip this page right now. This is a little bit of a demo about some of the companies that we're currently teaming with. Some of the people are in this room today. I know Dave Cox is teamed with us, Symantec, done a lot of work with Adam Madlin. If anybody's interested in partnering or getting involved in the center, please see me afterwards. I'll leave that discussion for the hallway con. And then getting into the building blocks. If you're interested in this project, you can go to our website. We have a document up there that's the building block document that sort of scopes out the problem. You'll see a lot of the same images and information you're seeing here today in that document. That document is in a revision state, and we are updating it. So actually, some of the stuff you'll see in this PowerPoint slide deck is a little more new. But in general, we're trying to demonstrate a federated identity system using attributes. And so federated maybe not only within an enterprise, so within one enterprise silo if you're a multinational organization, but also federated in between industries. And so if you look at, in between enterprises. So if you look at our document, you'll see 2 different use cases in there, one somewhere around the medical and healthcare sector and one centered around the energy sector. And so we have a very public service feel to those, public safety feel to those. So the idea would be that if we have a Katrina type of disaster, how does an individual from Louisiana Power and Tech get support from an individual at Tennessee Power and Electric when they come down to help with that, and what credentials do they present to them, and how do they know that that individual has the right to do lineman work or to do electric work or what they're really qualified to do. And so all of that involves attributes, and all of that is going to require a significant attribute assurance framework so that we can, make assertions about the accuracy and the veracity and security of the attributes that we're making those authentication and authorization decisions on. So here we have a brief high-level architecture. This document is obviously not final. We're accepting lots of feedback on this document, but we've put together a high-level architecture here in order to sort of fuel the discussion. A couple major points you'll see on here is that we have separated in this the IDP and the attribute provider. I know that I've heard in some of the conversations over the last couple of days that there's some contention around whether or not there should be a separation there or not. We have done that. We've also, as you can see, included both the authentication and authorization piece. So you have an unauthenticated user and then an authenticated user who's then entering the access control space. And you'll also see that we have right down here, this represents the ABAC implementation that might be within this one enterprise, whereas this subject attribute store over here and the identity provider over here represent a more federated model going through the exchange. I will actually go to the next. And so what the center really is it's an area that we can actually demonstrate some of these capabilities. And so we would actually implore any of the individuals in this room who are an IT vendor to please reach out to us and talk to us about your product. We would implore anybody who might be a consumer of an ABAC implementation to reach out to us and tell us what your major sticking points are and concerns. We've heard a lot over the last 3 days here at the IDSG about that, but we wouldn't hear a lot more specific to our project. We're still forming these architectures. We're still coming up with problem points and scoping this use case in a way that's going to allow us to get to an architecture that's going to be widely accepted and provide value to industry. And so there's a few different areas. There's a few different areas that we think that we can actually demonstrate areas surrounding attribute assurance. One is assertions of the provenance of attributes, what APs they've come from, what IDPs they've come from. Assertions around the accuracy of attributes. Is that attribute, is it unchanged? Did it get to the entity, the same way that it left the attribute provider? Obviously the assurance levels. A lot of the work that's already being done by Vincent and Art and Dave Ferriolo in their paper. And then some of the best practices around managing an attribute throughout its life cycle. So managing it through the instantiation, the actual assigning of that attribute to an individual, the passing of that attribute, the storage of that attribute, the use of that attribute, and then the decommissioning of that attribute or removal of that attribute. I have one more thing here as I run out of time, and this is a lot of information on this last page. But one thing we've tried to do at the center here is to try to enumerate what we call the trust chain, which starts with the credential issuance process, moves into an authentication session, and then moves into an authorization request. And so we've taken a lot of the vernacular from NIST documents, from other standards, from NASPO documents, and we've tried to put them into one overarching workflow so that as we put out our documents, we can all talk apples to apples and oranges to oranges, all the terminology that's in the document.
So a lot of those terms are defined now in PyCamp, and they're well known and well agreed upon. Yep. So this diagram, for example, is in direct conflict with PyCamp.
Okay.
And I think if we're going to change the directions and vocabulary, sure, we should do that wide open as opposed to, hey, surprise.
Right. Yeah, so one of the things that we found is actually trying to unify everybody's vernacular is...
They did that 4 years ago.
Okay. Well, that's great. I mean, we accept that kind of feedback.
Let's save this for the discussion.
Yeah, we love to take that kind of feedback. And we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're just saying, here we are standing up a project. We're this vector for collaboration for industry, and we're engaging the community, and so we're asking for your guys' type of support and help, and criticism is welcome so long as it's constructive.
All right, thank you very much, Bill.
Yeah.
This can be brought up again very soon.
Yeah, and I know that we did have some questions on the chat, but we are holding on
Yes,
those,
great,
correct?
thank you.
Okay.
All right, Kim, are we ready logistically now?
I'm ready now.
Okay, good. Okay, well, welcoming Kim Little-Sutherland back to talk about OIX again. Thanks.
Okay, so this time I think I'm going to have the right presentation. The one thing I want to say, I'll make it all up in a minute. The one thing I want to say is that I am taking off the plenary chair hat. This is Kim Little working for LexisNexis. It's important for you to think of it that way because when my customers come to me, they don't just use LexisNexis, right? They use multiple vendors to help them with trying to verify attributes associated with an individual. So one of the challenges in developing an attribute exchange network was how do we make sure that, and amazingly, a group of vendors came together and were thinking about the customer, not themselves, right? If you go to the next slide, you see our subgroup around business had a number of participants. We had people from ID Analytics, Experian, Equifax, LexisNexis, Pacific East, Trulio, Unbound ID. I want you to see that there was a broad group of people that were all working together to try to figure out how do we make this scenario, because we know that although I just heard you say that the terminology has been set, we don't speak the same language. Our terms are different in every company. Our customers even then rename our products to things that we didn't even name it as. And so our challenge was, if I say that I can verify your name, what do we even mean by name? So we did not agree that we had any standard terminology, and so the ability to try to have us all work together in a unified way and to have some level of attribute assurance does not exist. So I'm glad to see that we're having this conversation. Next slide. There were a number of objectives of our subgroup, but I'm just going to really focus on number 3, which is identify appropriate attribute scoring standard and data sources. Because we had nothing that we could even come together and be in common with, and there were months of conversations, right, Dave, to even try to get us to a point where we could even speak close to the same language. Next slide. And we can actually skip that slide since somebody think of time. Okay, so one of the things that we were trying to do again is to try to figure out from an attribute exchange standpoint, how can we have a marketplace of attributes? Because we know that people were dealing with things differently. So if we had the OIX, which is the Open Identity Exchange, for those of you who are not familiar, was trying to help support an attribute network. We kind of thought of attributes as being tiny bubbles, right? There are just tons of these tiny bubbles that all have different meanings and uses and everything. And the first step for us was to even agree that there are standard types of attributes. So the next slide. We all came into agreement with terms that most of us are all familiar with in here, that there are PI, personal information attributes, there are PIIs, personally identifiable information attributes, there's SPII, sensitive personally identifiable information, and PHI, personal health information. Not on here is things like PFIs, personal financial information. There are lots of attributes, and they can be categorized, but depending on the type of attribute, there are some, legal requirements for us to adhere to. So trying to make sure that we were all in alignment with where we were going to focus, we quickly said, for our group, we were not going to do a PHI because that was just very, very dangerous for us to deal with. Okay, so the attribute metric, which is really the key thing that we were trying to focus on, we thought that it would facilitate consistency in the manner that attributes are referenced, that standardization across the attribute providers, and a development of a monetization model because we are commercial organizations that need to get paid. So in our conversations around attributes, we dealt with some core metrics that we all agreed upon. This is not operational today, just want you to know. We did this working group, we developed a great white paper, and there are individual organizations that have taken components of it, but it's not some unified across all industry thing yet. Someday it could be, or whatever comes out of, the broader initiative. But we thought data type was critical, so is there a way for us to say if an attribute is referenced, authoritative, direct captured, self-asserted, derived, maybe there's more categories than that, but those are the ones that we could agree upon after months and months of arguing about it. Availability, is the attribute real-time or is it not real-time? How about the currency or refresh rate? And then when we get to the actual refreshes, does it get refreshed daily, hourly, monthly, annual? Does it never refresh? We didn't know. Geographic coverage, if I say I have phone number information, we felt it was responsible for us as vendors to say, what kind of coverage do you have? Is it global, is it national, is it regional, is it local only? Our coverage amount, and our verification method. So if I have addresses in the state of Georgia, do I have full coverage of that, or is it only partial? So here's what we were really trying to do. Is there a way for us to talk about what we have as a catalog, as a menu, and be honest about it? Fair statement, right? And so, because we know it's very challenging for the relying parties to be able to select amongst us. And we don't want to leave it just to marketing hype. We work very hard as companies to have quality information and quality data. It's a shame that sometimes it's difficult to be able to assess it. And then the verification method, verified by issuer, is it verified by a third party? Is there some type of out-of-band verification done with it? Is it not verified at all? And does it even matter depending on the data type, right? If it came from an authoritative source, does it need to be verified? If it came from a self-asserted source, probably, depending on the use case, it may need to be verified. Next slide. There were also attributes that we thought would be derived, like a level of confidence. That takes us back to that first presentation. We said, we didn't come up with levels of assurance or anything else around that, but we said that there should be some high, medium, low level of confidence, and more than likely, all of these things would create some type of functional way to determine a price. So I might be willing to pay more for an attribute that came from an authoritative data source that was refreshed in the last 30 seconds, and, you get the idea, versus an attribute that came from a self-asserted source that's never been verified or whatever. It still might be important. If I don't have an address for you and I need something, I might be willing to purchase that, but I'm not going to pay the same amount as I could from an attribute at a higher level. Okay. We even talked about the ability, again, it's very difficult for our reliant parties or for our customers. And so we said, what if we came up with some kind of label, whether that actually is some type of metadata that's incorporated into an API, that's a different, issue, but conceptually, we wanted to be able to find a way to make it visible that people could compare again the types of information that existed. Next slide. And additional goals were to be able to talk about core attributes, verification checks, social media attribute vetting, analytic scores, and out-of-band authentication. And even, some of these concepts, some of us, poo-pooed different components because maybe we didn't like it, right? It's not the way that we did things. But this whole conversation of trying to have the variety of attribute providers, and all attribute providers are not identity providers. LexisNexis is an attribute provider. We are today not an identity provider. But having those people at the table to talk was really a very beneficial source. And I recommend if you have not, if you're not aware that there was an OIX white paper on this, that please consider referencing it. And it goes into much more detail. And there, those individuals that were listed on the second slide, that from the different companies, we all have a vested interest in staying connected to it, and we would love to share more.
Is that on your website, the OIX?
It is.
Kim, what should they look for if they go to OIX or Open Identity Exchange?
There's a spot that talks about, I think, like white papers and resources.
There's a section called white papers. Good, thanks.
And then you can just download that, and there's detail on it. One thing that kind of got us started also in this whole conversation was the core identity attributes, because here's another challenge. So, again, my customers don't typically only use one vendor. So how do they make sure that as they're getting attributes from vendor A and vendor B, that they're even getting attributes on the same person, right? So I thought that I was getting some attributes for Kim Little from vendor A, and then I'm trying to get it from Kim Little from vendor B, but we're like, it's probably important to make sure there was a way to have a centralized way to ensure that I'm having a high assurance that I'm working with the same identity. And so that had us have conversations about identity resolution and core identity attributes, and I know there's lots of conversations always about that too with Anil and others. But uniqueness is really important in that scenario. And then the last thing was around, data minimization as well. Okay, go to the next slide. And so that's just a list. We said, we're starting this whole conversation around core identity attributes. What does that mean, and how does that help us in our initiative? Next slide. So our next steps were to get final approval from the broader committee, which we did, to test the template and adoption with other attribute providers. We didn't. To test template and adoption with reliant parties. We didn't. And to roll out, to begin this compilation process. We didn't. But what we did do is we did a white paper, and then individual organizations have started to adopt it. So I think that this should not be ignored. It was some really good work that we did, and there's more behind the scenes, but I wanted to at least present it to you. Thank you.
Kim, thank you very much. Our last speakers are to talk about perspective from the NSTIC pilots, or at least two of the pilots. Dave Cox from Criterion Systems, and I'm told it's Ryan Fox, not, sorry. Is it Ryan Fox? FOX from ID.me. I don't know, did you coordinate how you're going to do this, one after the other? Or?
Ryan, why don't you go ahead? Whichever briefing comes up first, we can just roll
Okay.
I'm happy to go first.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah, Kim, we should put your paper on the, assuming there's an ad hoc attribute group under the security committee, we should post it there as well.
Yeah, so I think that the OIS shouldn't have a problem with that, but I'd make sure that
Okay.
I don't.
Yeah, then maybe
not my
IRX
paper.
issue with that. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
It's referenced in the ABAC,
Okay.
her link, maybe just a link to the OIS
A link,
site.
sure.
Then you'll have to.
Okay, we ready? I'm Ryan Fox with ID.me. We are one of the 2013, 2014, 2015 grant awardees, running a pilot under the NSTIC program office. What I'm going to do today is give you a quick overview of what I guess at this point many of you probably have seen, which is who we are and what we do, and then dive into some of my hopefully insightful postulations on attribute assurance. Good? You have 2 slides there. ID.me, founded by 2 Army Rangers, we really started out focused on the veteran population and tearing down the walls between the benefits, the offers and the deals that they were afforded and the ability to access them in a digital context. So we started issuing digital credentials to those folks so that they didn't have to fax in a stack of paperwork to get 10% off on a pair of underwear. We moved from there as we started to learn from the market. There was more than just veterans that needed this service. We moved into students, teachers, first responders, et cetera. And the co-founders quickly realized that, hey, we're actually in the digital identity business here. So that's where the ID.me kind of nomenclature came from. ID.me is an overarching network that issues credentials out underneath of that specific to the context in which they're used. Think about this in the terms of a credit card processing network, where you have a Bank of America card issued by Visa, a Wells Fargo card issued by Visa, or in some circumstances an Amex card issued by Amex. That's the kind of paradigm that we're operating in. Go ahead. So today, this is kind of where we are. Again, responded to the market, moved beyond veterans. We've engaged in the certification process to have the underlying core identity of our digital credentials escalated beyond self-asserted level 1, which we are certified at or almost certified at. I'm not exactly sure the total status of that. I don't know if anyone can tell me, but and moving to level 2 and 3 sometime in late July. Go ahead. This is just a quick screenshot of what the product looks like in the wild. This is Under Armour. Under Armour was here with us earlier this week in a checkout flow. So the use of your digital ID.me credential, you're checking out, and you see that you can assert that identity at that point in time to receive a benefit and offer. You can enroll at that point in time. It's a distributed user acquisition process as well. Enrollment takes less than 60 seconds. It's a real-time process. Go ahead. Screenshot from a market research paper that we put out, again, discussing the actual value that this drove. 30% revenue increase for Under Armour in the first year that they used the program, 70% new user to file. Moving forward, where we're going, and again, I'm just buzzing through these to get to the actual kind of meat of what you all are here to talk about today. Where we're going, we're moving to expand this to really omni-channel. So later this year, we're releasing a centralized marketplace where you can come and actually share more about yourself. If you started off as a veteran, you can come and you can share social credentials, financial information, et cetera, into this personal data bank, which then allows you to convert that data into renewable online currency. We're introducing programs such as card linking so that you can actually bind a payment vehicle with your identity and have an omni-channel experience. So really moving beyond that kind of distributed model that we originally talked about and the actual identity credentials to have a true omni-channel multi-factor experience that you can assert your identity in a brick and mortar, through a payment vehicle, through a mobile device, online. Go ahead. You can skip this one. I kind of articulated that early on. So thoughts on attribute assurance. I kind of took some of the data points that were given to us when we were asked to share this and tried to distill them out a little bit. So these are just kind of data points on how we do business. Pricing, we do per transaction, subscriptions, or user pricing. It just depends on who the relying party is, what their business model is. Is it someone that's expecting to see a recurrent user, a guest user, et cetera? The pricing model varies. Liability, something that we spend a lot of time kind of wringing our hands about. I just wanted a couple of data points for you all on how we handle that. We assume data breach liability, and we really focus on the liability around attribute integrity. So we don't necessarily ensure that the attribute that's being asserted is accurate. We just ensure that the attribute that's being asserted is the same as the attribute that I pulled, that there wasn't some type of compromise that occurred between the pull, the storage, and the assertion. So so it's the integrity of that process that we're actually ensuring. Other contract considerations. SLAs, you have these attribute providers out there, and they have different SLAs. So you'll have relying parties that levy, hypothetically, a 30-millisecond response time, and you hypothetically have a hypothetical government repository that has a 1 to 3 second response time. And you must trickle those through and be able to resolve those in your contracting situation, and it can become interesting. Attribute trust. The trust of the attributes, there's a lot of discussion that you guys are engaged in. RRPs just want to know where we got it. Where did it come from? Was it something that someone asserted itself about themselves? Was there an authoritative source there? Was there some type of antecedent in-person activity that was involved in that? Where did it come from, and how is it getting to me? That's really all they want to know. Go to the next slide. So this was my thought on attribute assurance with regards to high assurance and the context that we're operating in today. The internet didn't lead off with online banking. We didn't start off with people engaging in high-value transactions and putting their medical records online. We're just getting there today, right? And so when we talk about identities and we talk about attributes, I think we may think we're further along than we are. We may actually be in a Model T situation, but we think we're in an assessment situation. What we've found is that it's best to start off small with low-value transactions, earn trust, demonstrate value, and grow the programs to be out there. Good? It's all attribute-based access control. This is my opinion that many people will, I'm sure, disagree with. But whether we're talking about access to a classified document based on your clearance level, or I'm talking about giving you 10% off on your latest T-shirt purchase, it's an attribute that's being asserted to access a resource or an offer or a deal or whatever the case may be. And the same principles apply. So solving it for a small purpose that has perhaps a lower risk and then growing it slowly, again, back to that snowball mentality, versus starting at the top and trying to solve for high impact and then working backwards, I think may be a more viable approach. Identity versus attributes. This was a question that was kind of posed in our queue-up document here. Identity is simply a collection of attributes. I subscribe to an approach that we have this digital DNA that is basically a unique, highly unique, if not entirely unique, collection of digital attributes about ourselves. When we talk about attributes and we talk about the value of those, we talk about the assurance of those, legal and intelligence principles apply, preponderance of evidence and totality of circumstances. Where did it come from? What's the total context of that? How often has it been used? By whom? What was it relied upon for? One-time identity binds are less valuable than recurrent binds. What I mean by this is if I engage in a identity proofing exercise to receive a high assurance credential that I use once a year, regardless of how strong we may believe that that process is, my observation and my belief is that that is of less value than a medium assurance credential that is used 20 times a day. Because if there is fraud, if there is lack of integrity in that credential, the likelihood of that being found, discovered, exposed is much greater, thereby increasing the actual value and the trust in that credential itself. And then finally, data lineage is key. Where did it come from? Did somebody touch, see, potentially smell that individual at any given point in time to discern that attribute about that person? So that is ID.me's and Ryan Fox's thoughts on attribute assurance. Happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ryan. Let's go to Dave first, and then we'll open up.
The work we did at OAX actually took 18 months of harsh debate and sometimes, tears and everything else that comes with that kind of process. And I think there was some really good work done, but we recognized it wasn't complete. So, we won't apologize for it. We published it. It's for open consumption as a guidebook for what to do next, we think. And what we did simultaneously is we, at ID GataWeb and Criterion Systems, implemented an attribute exchange network. And actually, we started prior to the work at OAX. And some of the learnings we got from that process, we implemented in the process, so in our system. So I'm not going to talk a lot about it. I really want to focus on attributes and the types that we expose in our system and kind of make a statement that is the relying parties in our ecosystem are the customers, and they specify what they want in any context of a transaction. So we have in our ecosystem identity providers who do proof users, and they gather things from the users either online or in person from source documents, and that's all well known. And when you do it on that, there's a whole lineage of those documents or the attributes associated with that. And in fact, we can automate that process. We do have customers that consume the attributes through exchange because they get some benefits from that. The other folks we have are commercial attribute providers, like LexisNexis, Experian, Equifax, AT&T, and TransUnion Data. These are folks that can verify attributes real time based on assertions that are asserted attributes, user-asserted attributes, which is one of the classifications, from the user. Or it can be taken, in a combination of different transactions. I'll walk you through those. But the other piece of attributes which are for ABAC are, and it's going to be used in the context of a transaction to verify the fact that you're an employee, the fact that you are contextually in a specific geographic zone. Whatever may be appropriate for the relying party service is trying to grant you authorized service. So it's not a real simple answer. What we found is that it's much more complex. One layer of complexity that we've also found is that a single relying party who is a customer, one customer in our case is an application or a website, is a lot different from dealing with a federation of relying parties. If you're dealing with the supply chain of the defense industrial base, they come up with a set of common operating rules and standards in which they say everybody must have this credential type, they must have these types of attributes, we need to verify them from these sources, and they define the rules for a federation transaction. That basically becomes their high assurance credential marketplace for attribute verification. So let me just walk you through a couple things. Just, again, the RPs, in our marketplace, we're a cloud service, and we have identity providers from low assurance credentials, Google, Facebook, AOL, LinkedIn, up to high assurance credentials, Verizon, Symantec, level 3 to level 4, PKI, some not necessarily certified under the government programs, but at this point in time, they do provide high assurance credentials. We also have folks that will do affiliation verification. So those in that context, if you're working for an agency or for an enterprise, they're authoritative because they have your job stat and they can basically verify your status. The other things that we have are some private associations. Take an AARP or a AAA where they say you're a member. That's an affiliation that is related to your membership status. You can begin to glean a lot of different use cases out of this, an infinite number, quite frankly, depending upon whether you're interfacing like IDE is in many consumer transactions, doing enterprise, government, or some personal work, personal cloud that's evolving out today. So, I guess the point when somebody starts saying, what is an attribute, it all depends on the context and the requirement in our world. It's really not something you can standardize. Because in our world, basically a relying party is not an agency, it's the application the agency is trying to expose. So, go ahead. Just keep on going. Oh, one last thing. So, in our world also, device IDs, biometrics are attributes. We generate assertions. We're a claims management system. So we're verifying the fact that your picture matched to what's on record or in file. The fact that you assert attributes, name, address, and telephone number, and you push it up to Experian, for example, versus LexisNexis, the formats and the API interfaces are completely different. And we had to normalize that. And we did that using a variety of methods. And that's some of the power that comes in this change model. Also the refresh rate. We handle that dynamically. When a relying party registers, they specify those criteria, geographic coverage, all those things that Kim was talking about, we've actually built into the onboarding process. Oh, one last thing. There's another class of attributes, preferences. I don't know if you saw that come up. User assertions about what they want, how they want to interface with your service. The fact is, my favorite color is blue. Yours may be red. Retailers may think that's valuable to them, but it's a user-controlled assertion. The fact that I'm a student is a type of attribute, but the fact that I'm a student that loves geography or history might actually provide information to whatever I'm interfacing with about what they want to provide me as a preferred interaction. So there are lots of types of preferences. It's very important to put things in context of the relying party service. And this is this slide here. Again, when you take that down to the next level, a relying party is going to try to mitigate risk. They're going to tell you what they want. To standardize that is very difficult. It really is, and you guys have done a great job if I can. But what we found in the commercial space is that General Electric Health handles General Electric oil and gas, General Electric, finance, totally differently. And even when they have, hundreds and thousands of applications that have owners of those applications that specify what they want to have for you to get authorized to a service. Okay? So the point of this slide, and this is coming from Gardner, some work that Ian and all the folks did out there at the Catalyst Conference, and you put that down, is that depending upon the constituency that you're exposing a service to and the purpose of the service, you may adopt different techniques. You may have a level 4 credential for accessing a government site that's highly classified, a CAT card, a TIVI card. You may say username password sufficient, but then you can layer cake a variety of methods like attribute-based access control. So in the context of exposing something to the public for ease of use and usability, you may say, come on with an OpenID credential from Google, Facebook. So the bottom line is that the exchange model that we work with allows the relying parties to pick and choose services. Go ahead. Just 1 or 2 slides. Go ahead. And device IDs in the context, and biometrics in the context of PII, what we started working through at OIX was trying to analyze what are the different combination of attributes. There's been a lot of great work, if I can, looking at that and examining that, and studies that have been done by other organizations as well, including LexisNexis. What we found is that when you're online, it's a lot different from in person. People online, the relying parties say, well, it's great that you gave me these great attributes, but I really want to know some more. Which device are they using when they come in? Can we check some other things in the context of the transaction? Go ahead. Last but not least, ABAC. Okay, so in the world that we live in, our exchange is a cloud service where an identity is a service that deals with a variety of things I just mentioned. But I think, as Art was pointing out, and I think we saw on the ABAC use case, what's going on in NCCOE, there is, in the relying party infrastructure, a policy engine. And that policy engine is sitting there, and basically you have documents or objects that, users they're trying to expose to different users and constituents. So how do you do that? You have to document, you have to label the documents and objects and services with access rights in a class of users. In ABAC, you have general classes of users, and you have classes of documents or objects. So the problem that right now is a lot of these folks haven't been tagged. It's going to be done in a second. But the way that the exchange would interface with this is we register the requirements of the policy engine as the relying party. And we gather, as the user comes to that relying party service, we gather all the requirements for credentials, authenticate the user, the attributes that are required in the context of the transaction, and feed it to the policy engine, and it does a lookup on the table and says, you got everything I need? Go ahead, you get this. Now, we demonstrated this live with TIVI credentials with Lockheed, Boeing, and Raytheon in a common SharePoint repository where they put documents in there that had been labeled. And based on the attributes that came through and were verified through this process, the Lockheed guy saw Lockheed documents, the Boeing guy saw Boeing documents, and so on and so forth. So you can do this at scale, but it requires some innovation in how you label the documents and how you manage the policy engine. That's all I've got.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all our speakers who volunteered their time to present the different perspectives on attributes. The rest of our time here, which is a little under an hour, is for comments and questions from anyone. But I believe we have some online. Do we have that?
All right, yes, this is everybody.
Sorry?
The comments that were online, there were some specific questions to different...
They were? I'm sorry?
Yeah, there were specific questions to different graphs and presentations and things like that.
That's fine. We can start.
So we could revisit those.
Are there many? We talk about a couple and then come into the room. I can't read any of that.
I didn't make it clear. I think Steve Rana had the first question, and it was in regards to Bill's presentation on a diagram. And we can ask him to state it if you'd like. And can hear it.
If he's on mute.
Yes. Steve Rana?
All right, well, why don't you go on to the next one? We'll see if he comes back.
I have a question. Yes. Okay. Yeah, my question was simple. I think that there was a picture which was shown with the user interacting with the IDP, and there's some cloud or something in between IDP and the attribute core provider. I was wondering, how that picture came about. Typically, the interaction between the user and the attribute provider is direct, not through the IDP. I could be wrong. I just wanted to understand where that came from, or how that came about.
I'm assuming you're referring to our high-level attribute ABAC, our high-level ABAC architecture, and are you referring to the green subject in the middle that is interacting with the Exchange service?
No, actually, maybe a little bit further down. Yeah, that picture is 10.
So are you referring to the green subject?
Sorry.
Yeah, are you referring to the green user in the middle that's interacting with the Attribute Exchange platform?
Oh, I didn't see that. Okay, so there is that subject there. Okay, I was looking at the orange kind of user on the left-hand side.
Did you still have a specific question? So again, as I mentioned in the brief, we are including authentication and not just authorization. And so that authentication could be an out-of-band authentication where the user would authenticate themselves to an IDP, and then that IDP would verify that authentication via an attribute exchange, which would then be provided to a relying party. That's just one model. That's, again, I know there's other ways of doing that, but that's just one model that we've chosen to demonstrate here.
Okay, I just want to point out there's a lot we could talk about. This is an attribute assurance roundtable, so kind of the mechanics of identity or exchange of attributes narrowly defined is maybe unfortunately for some of you, it's not really the focus of this or intention of this roundtable. It was assurance, or if you prefer trust in the attributes, if you want to look at it that way, which I understand could be part of the exchange, but it's certainly not the whole chain. So if we can keep the questions and comments to that, I think that would be great. Okay.
Another question.
Sure.
Okay, so I think it was Kim's slide had the low, medium, high. Did people like it, not like it? Do they want something more binding score?
And just to add to it, how low, medium, and high, are to be defined. I mean, it could be a numeric score or whatever. It was just a way, again, kind of like the IDME team said that the company who's trying to buy these services or use these attributes or agencies trying to use it, they need to have it simple, right? And so if we have some type of thing that's difficult for them to grasp, no one's going to adopt attribute assurance. But if they can ultimately map it to something simple with our approach.
So I was a big fan of that low, medium, high model. I do think that finding is key. It can be defined as in something sort of verified equals medium or whatever it is being, but the definitions need to be published and agreed to. I completely agree with you.
I really disagree with low, medium, high on attributes. I'm sorry?
1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, I disagree with
small
any.
scale.
I disagree with anything highly delineated. Let me be more specific there, and would maybe think that it might be good to consider more of an artifact model, such as what you see in an ITIL or an ISO environment, where you have specifics around the assurance levels, but then it's up to the relying party to decide if the artifacts are sufficient for their needs.
That's always the case. So
yeah.
If the attribute provider gives an attribute of assurance level medium, and it's for a discount for a website, that might be sufficient. But if it's actually specified, they might require high.
Yeah.
Always the RP's job to make the decision based on the...
My observation has been that within the identity assurance space, that the levels 1, 2, and 3 are often fractured within their own environment, and I'm not sure how much clarity they've provided. When people, if you take the IRS, for example, they have level 2, I think it's D, C, E, and F. I don't know what that means exactly, but it was clearly not enough granularity for them, and I just wonder if we'll get into that same scenario if we go down that kind of bucketed approach to attributes.
So it is interesting, right? So I do think that
organizations that have a very nuanced view of risk tend to be a lot more mature at both defining and accepting risk in a transaction, and which is important. And so context is important. So both Josh and I are on the federal government side. We co-chair the attribute governance and access control, whatever, it's a working group, tiger team, call it whatever you want. So it's a cross-government effort. So be aware that when we are talking, we are speaking from that particular perspective, and our desire is not to make that a general case. It is the case of what we are doing. So from that perspective, so at a high level, right, there are two arguments that often come into play. Is there even an attribute assurance, or should there need to be attribute assurance, or should it be the fact that basically you establish a relationship with an attribute provider and there is some things that you need to find out about that attribute provider and its processes in order to do business with them? So it's a design time criteria evaluation that you're doing, and if you do so, you trust what they say. So that is one argument. The other argument is, hey, attributes, wherever they're coming from, carry intrinsically some sort of a thing that you can judge the quality associated with them. We're having that discussion internally. We can share if people are interested where we are at right now. It's not the end, but I will note that it is a distinction, and it is also important to very clearly have a common terminology that we are using when we are talking about attribute. I've seen validation, verification, resolution, magical stuff thrown around all over the place, right? Ultimately, when it comes to attributes of people, I will keep the NPEs out of it right now for those people, non-person entities.
I think the purpose for authentication is creating a credential or for other purposes?
So from, in our context, right? So in our context, there are two pieces. One of them is basically attributes that are associated with identity, whether it is basically onboarding somebody into an RP. So it is uniqueness aspect of it. The other piece of it is obviously the entire thing about the entitlement, access control, and things of that nature. We tend to focus on the latter more than anything else. On our Tiger team, obviously, I spend some amount of time on the first piece as well in my other role. But the long and the short of it is, so when you talk about attributes, consider, I leverage the Canadian terms on this because they actually think very clearly about this. Validation is basically checking to see if that information is true based on a reference to an authoritative attribute source. Verification is actually tying that set of true attributes to a particular person, right? So you need both, and it might be done by entirely different entities. So I will stop there simply from the perspective that I think we need clear definitions and clear language to have the conversation about. Okay.
One thing, please.
Can I add myself to the queue?
For the benefit of those on the phone.
Sure. My name
I would like to add to.
Yes, sir.
Okay. We have a couple of folks in the room.
Yeah, before we go back to phone, so.
I just wanted to, since I'd asked the question first, just sort of wrap, and I just think that we should look at things like, when you fill out a survey of consumer and they're like, I strongly agree, I strongly disagree, and there's usually about 5 that make it up. I think that makes more sense than 3 if we were going to have assurance levels. And then I do think that the RP needs to have a view in to see, well, just because I think it's strong and I'm the attribute provider, what is it that I actually did so you can make the decision yourself?
But I like the idea of a survey. Hopefully we captured the names of the folks here in the room. I know there was a sign-in list, but I think based on the comments and discussion we had this afternoon, Jerry, maybe we should think about sending out a survey to see if we can get, maybe not consensus, but maybe the direction people are thinking about. Attributes,
for instance, low,
should it be metrics?
There should be a no assurance.
Yeah.
I'm giving
Okay,
you absolutely no
just before we go too fast, the goal of this was certainly not to come to a consensus on terminology and whether you need ordinal assurance levels, whether it's 3, 5, or 100, right, granularity, versus no, you have a prior arrangement, do your due diligence, and then you just accept or not. It was really to say what are these questions that should be followed up in, say, in this workshop or within IDESG. And I don't think, and even right after, I don't think we're going to survey and then get the answers, you know, from a survey of the people in the room. But so far I'm hearing that these are at least a couple of questions that should be or need to be followed up and probably have been of the 18 months at OAX, and maybe they had one answer, which was what we had. But all right, so to move on. So I think we had, next to me we had, I'm sorry.
Sure. Maybe this is Paul Grassi with NIST. Maybe this is, Neil, what you were getting at. I mean, why even calculate assurance? If we do our job and define the metadata appropriately and the values that need to sit in that metadata, let the RP define what their confidence level is in that.
Well,
Okay, sorry, go ahead. Identify yourself.
Ryan Page, I'm here by myself. I think there might be, as far as determining that, one of the questions may be, under what circumstances would an attribute provider say, I've got low assurance? Particularly in the context of this group where a lot of the transactions are commercial. If I'm Equifax, am I going to hand over somebody's credit rating and say, I'm not really sure about all these loans. It looks like there's a lot, I don't really know, but you should make a decision based on it that's detrimental to this person's, economic well-being, and I'm going to put it on the record that I think these attributes are crap. So who's going to do that? Who's going to say I've got a hearsay attribute? I mean, I'm not saying it won't happen, but it would be good to have at least a use case.
Okay. I think, excuse me, I think Kim wants to answer that, and then we'll go around. Sorry, Kim?
We absolutely do that.
Yeah.
I mean, there is not a time, our goal is to be as transparent as possible within our business model with our customers. And so there are plenty of times when there's an attribute that they need to understand why they're paying different price points, right? Okay. So in the event that we have a data source that we know is, we're not sure. Like, we have this information, but we know for sure that this one comes from this particular source. As a result, there's higher assurance data sources and there's lower assurance. So within I think we have like 40,000 different data sources. They're all not equivalent.
Okay, I'd like to go to the phone and then over to this side of the room. And I'm going to guess that the providers probably won't say this is an attribute with crap assurance, right? It'll be low, or they'll come up with even a better marketing name for it, right?
I think it's
self-asserted right here. I'd like to go to the phone. Sorry.
There are two people with questions.
Okay.
Anne Rakuya Robbins has her hand raised.
Okay, Anne, and then we'll go to this side of the room to give people a chance. Anne?
Thank you. Well, I can see why a government would have a stake in the assurance, especially certain parts of government, perhaps. I can see why enterprises might be engaged in it, although there seems to be a fair amount of distrust across enterprises. But I don't know, I'm hearing an echo, but I don't know why users would want to participate in this. And the kind of world that I see being created here creates a terrific incentive for an entirely parallel way of going about all of this that is more user-centric. In a good sense. And there's so much money to be made here. I really don't understand why, the only value proposition is, a discount or a negligibly valuable coupon. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Now, I'm not sure people have been saying that's the only use case. We perhaps just haven't gone through them. I think Dave even said, I think he used the term infinite use cases. So, but maybe as we talk more, people will talk more about other areas other than perhaps pure ABAC or discounts or whatever.
But just a user, for instance, might care that on a dating site that you're actually a male. Like I might actually care that you're different gender, or that you are right?
Unless
Or
you are
that you're
married,
married, that you're divorced, that you're really not married, for instance. So, I think.
Might be interested in that.
Okay.
So going over this side of the room, give people a chance, we had, sorry, go ahead. Right, and then we'll go to the back.
Sorry.
Hi, Joel Hardy, Equifax. I wanted to weigh in a little bit on the ordinal versus other sorts of things. And I mean, just to take an example of an address, there's cases where, obviously I think, asserted but verified standard and use case just as your goal is to send mail to somebody. That's probably better than something you're pulling off of a record-based. Then you've got different quality levels of sources. Even something like a social security number, SSA is the authoritative source, but they've got millions of bogus SSNs, whereas, we can tell you about whether the SSN is actually being used, sort of along the lines of what Ryan was talking about as far as, actual philosophy of correct use of something versus, data sources.
You have to see how any of those things we just described don't work with an ordinal-based assurance for that attribute. If you say SSN 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I am sure it's valid as being used. Whereas 2, 3, 4, 6 it's a legit number, but it's never been used before. So the number, the system works for both.
Yeah, I'm just sort of saying, I think I'm trying to tie it more to the use case, for something like the address, right? What's the RP's use case? Is the RP's use case to do pure identity resolution? Is part of that identity resolution process sending something?
This is requires you to authenticate to store the color of your background screen. Can use LOA 1. If it's more important things like your banking information and your criminal information, they require higher level of assurance. Same concept. There's no difference between the two.
Sure. I wanted to raise a question about metadata too, which was just sort of, one piece of metadata with a piece of information like an address or even a name really is what were the dates that address was active. Is that something, I'm kind of curious, I don't know if there are any RPs, that's something that interests me as to with whether, especially for identity resolution with FICAM, sort of what we're hearing is that, agencies really only do ID resolution off of PII. SSN, partial SSN, and date of birth seem to be required because what they're falling back on is kind of a primitive record matching process. It's not like what LN or we have where we can look at a trusted data model and match off of a 6-year-old address and a fragment of somebody's like married and still identify a single individual. Those are just some of the extra and identity resolution, I feel like, by our
Okay, so I'm going to come along. That indeed was one criticism of attribute assurance was that isn't that just an attribute of an attribute, and then how do you really logically end that and how do you around that, and don't go down that road. I've heard that before as well. Right? Obviously, there are different views here. So I'm going to come back this way and back around. So yeah.
So I had a.
Oh.
Same angle as this one.
Pardon? Sure. I'm going to go over.
Standard use. I guess I'm with 5 years. Anyway. So I am definitely not an expert in attributes or attribute assurance. So I'm going to ask everyone a question to think about. Maybe. How much value is there in putting a standard or defining a standard around the metadata of attributes as it relates to quality, and like accuracy, currency, all that? Like the metadata that we were talking about stuff. There's no standardized way to provenance and attributes of attributes. So should the focus of attribute assurance be are those methods?
So an answer from one particular community, right? I'll throw out the entire assurance piece to the side for now. The reason we are focused on attributes, at least within our context, is that there is value in a common syntax and semantics of how we define attributes when we do inter-organizational exchanges, so that both sides of the wire agree that when something comes across it, what was sent is what was meant and sent by one end means the same thing on the other end. So we are actually standing up an attribute registry that basically has a onboarding process, and we will eventually stand up again. Yes. That basically defines that syntax and semantics, defines a set of metadata around each attribute with the intent to basically reach common agreement on the most painful part of it, basically the common definition. Now, we are not talking about the assurance aspect of it at this point in time when we're discussing it, but the driver for us is common language and understanding of each attribute to start off with.
Okay.
But how widely should that be?
Well, I think we'll come around this way. Andrew, I think if you look at the OAX spec, for instance, that is one proposal, right, of here are the quote-unquote standard, or what could be the standard, ways of what you should describe an attribute as and what they mean. Now, as Kim said, I think it's not been universally adopted or adopted at all in whole, right, but that's another question. That's one attempt, and it took a while to get there, right? And there are other attempts. Also to define terminology. What does a name mean? Whatever in different places as well. Right. So I want to come this way. Sorry, you.
Yeah, Sarbari Gupta, Microsoft. In talking about attribute assurance, I also wanted to talk about a different dimension that we haven't quite discussed today, which is as soon as you pull the ID provider apart from the attribute provider, there's also a resolution that needs to happen between the two entities so that you're talking about the same identity. So, for example, if you get an attribute about a Bill Smith, is that attribute about the Bill Smith you're talking about here, or is it one of 100 or 1,000 other Bill Smiths?
Yeah. I think Kim mentioned that in her presentation, right, about the two Kim Littles. Are they really the same Kim Little? Yes. So, I mean, we'll note that. I think everyone. I shouldn't say everyone. What I've heard is there's an agreement that, of course, without that, the assurance could be as high level on the attribute you want, but you don't know who it applies to. It's of maybe limited use. So I'm sorry, I'm going to...
So John Bickham is driving you crazy.
Okay, so let me stay here, and then we'll go.
If my colleague wouldn't mind yielding, I'd like to follow on.
Okay, go ahead.
I'd like to, first of all, second the points that's made, that in a former life, I was a red team white hat hacker, and so I kind of have my mind likes to jump to how would I abuse this system you guys are talking about, and I would abuse it exactly that way. That there would be a John Smith that would have a colored credit rating, and there'd be a John Smith that had a horrible credit rating, and I would, be able to demonstrate that I was the John Smith with a horrible credit rating, but somehow see how I could figure out if I could get that attribute of the John Smith, the great one. I see people getting that, but man, I haven't seen anything in any of the presentations that make me feel a little more sanguine about this concern. The second and third points I'll make equally briefly. They're unrelated to the first. I'm John Bickham, Microsoft, by the way, and I would like to see that our products are engineered to play in this space. So a lens that I'd like you all to have is, are we on a trajectory such that the output of that process is something that I can engineer to, and my competitors can engineer to? And the third point is related to the second, and that is, we live in a heterogeneous world. And as a Microsoft stockholder, I would love it if, like, all of our customers had nothing but Microsoft stock. But that's a fantasy world. The reality is that I'm interoperating with all of my competitors. And if you look at crossing organizational boundaries, that heterogeneity becomes even, it's like a quantum problem. So we need to have standards that can transcend proprietary boundaries. We need to have standards that can transcend organizational boundaries. But most of all, we need to have standards that are specific enough that engineers can engineer products that transcend those boundaries.
Thank you. Next.
Adrian Groff for Patient Privacy Rights. I may have missed it, but I didn't hear a very important crossover point between identity and attribute that we're here together, and that is a situation where, for privacy reasons, I want to provide a verified attribute but not provide an identity. Say the 13-year-old that wants to sign into a website without providing any kind of identity or tracking information, and that serves two purposes. It provides a safe harbor for the relying party, as well as a safe harbor for the parent or the child's interest. And so I want to make sure that as we cross-reference the work of IDSG and FICAM or other groups that are focusing on identity, the two horizontal and vertical in Kim's presentation, we don't lose sight of the fact that this is a very important feature to provide.
I think that's a good point. I think it is being looked at. Maybe it wasn't said here. There are technologies looking at that. There are models where you have brokers which kind of hide, have a blind or a double blind. One company calls it triple blind. Maybe that's part of the marketing. I don't know. So that the relying party does not know necessarily who you are or who your provider is. They just know you're 13 or older, whatever it is, right? So there are things going on, but you're right. Maybe it wasn't spoken of in the short presentation.
We can support those use cases. We just don't have customers that that's right.
So I'm looking behind me now. No one.
There is a question on the phone as well.
Okay, let me just go behind me first. Yes, did you?
Yeah.
Or you've forgotten it?
No,
I just have a quick one.
Oh, you ready or? Yeah. Okay, go, please. We've been waiting for a half hour.
I'm sorry, I forgot your name this time. Oh, me? Yeah. Joel.
Yeah.
Joel, sorry. Oh, yeah, I can definitely read that.
With my hand over.
Brian, so my question for you guys, maybe a bit of a challenge is, I'm hearing not ordinal, not ordinal, not ordinal. Are you suggesting nominal, or are you suggesting interval, or something else?
I mean, I think it depends on the individual attribute and the use case, and I would sort of talk about address, right, as one where the use cases are so variable that it's almost impossible to, make it, ordinal at all, but, I think in other cases, I think if you want to map it to levels of assurance, you can do that. I think the devil's in the details kind of thing.
I think it's all driven off the risk framework of the organization doing it, and those risk frameworks will be so diverse that it makes it difficult to have a reusable ordinal framework. And so it really depends upon who the consuming body is, right? So if we're developing that for a government consumption and that makes sense, then fine, let's do that. But in a commercial sector, we spend a lot of time discussing FICAM and, hey, we're part of the SimStig pilot, and we're going to have level of assurance 1 through 3 credentials. And they say, well, what does that mean, and why do I care? Well, it means that you can really trust it. Why can't I really trust it? Because I did X, Y, and Z. Oh, well, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I can really trust that. But the level 1 through 3 didn't mean anything to them. They weren't like, well, when you get to 3, give me a call, and then we'll work with you. That doesn't play there, right? That's not applicable. And so that's my concern with the ordinal and the universal.
Our customers are driven by two things. One thing they're driven by is risk, and the other thing is compliance. And those are totally separate. If it's compliance driven, sure, we got to go LOA2, and we're going to check these boxes. But if it's risk, and they're looking at actually, are we going to give this person an iPhone and risk that they're going to drop it to somebody to ship to China? Those kinds of truly risk decisions. They're the most sophisticated customers are building all their own risk models. They're building all their own decision trees, and we're providing attributes to them. And those attributes are standardized, and we have specific processes for, basically mapping the data and building it into specific attributes. But a lot of our innovation in that space is around what the attributes are, and I'm not sure there's a way to sort of, and what they're looking for really is attributes that, anytime we give them a computed attribute that's too level of a high of a contribution, of a calculation, they're going to want something lower level, because their risk engines are, all basically homegrown, and then, that's part of their sort of things that they're not going to share with their, with their.
Okay, I'm going to move down here. I think that's clearly a topic, right, that what type of assurance, ordinal or not. Are there relying parties who, at some time in the future, might say, yeah, I know what 3 is good, other than the compliance, or is there no need for that? Are they willing to put in the time to really analyze what is being given them? Or would they appreciate a nice, easy, I know what 2 is, that's all I need, I don't want to hear all the details, right? I don't know, right, based on maybe some certification or whatever, other than government or compliance. This is a question that I don't know if we have an answer for yet. Some think yes, others I think strongly feel no, they don't see any evidence, right?
And the only thing I want to throw in, though, is that a lot of this, in reaction to the picture I put up there, was that if you remember, there was the price and the level was on a separate slide, and they were under derived attributes. They were not things that were going to be this fixed way of looking at it. And so derived could mean that it's different by every attribute and by every company that you're working with. But the whole concept is that that one has to be a lot more fluid than a static one on the previous slide. I just want to point that out.
That's a good point. Okay, I'm coming down here and then back to the phone. So, yes, sir.
So,
you can identify yourself.
Ken Klingenstein, Internet 2. I'll make this a bulleted list since there were a number of things to react to. I think there's a need for a functional model for attribute assurance. You referenced it. Neil started us down the path with 2 components of that. I think it's an early deliverable. I can't believe I'm endorsing a functional model, but I am.
I think there was another meeting about that right here.
Well, secondly, a number of us came here because we've lived in the attribute swamp for years. We're not into attribute assurance, however. We're into other parts of the problem space. We'll find some other place, I hope, within IDESG to dwell. But you're going to have a codependency on our issues as well. And the question of how attribute assurance wants to handle the codependency of those who are looking at meta attributes, which is a swamp that I just dove into, which gets back into name. And I'm thrilled that so many of you know the pain of name, which leads to my last point, which is I live in a different world. I live in an interfederated world. International. So I don't do federated identity anymore. I do interfederated identity. And in that space, the world changes significantly. It's multilateral federation. The federated operator has a chance to normalize across, boundaries of what kind of quantification do you want, et cetera. We are deep in the business of beginning to translate between our R&E federations. GNR federation, that's known as the Spanish surname, blah, 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 or whatever. And so the degree to which we think about multilateral activities, and I think IDESG is really about multilateral, we sit here and discuss bilateral relationships. We can create mechanisms, perhaps through FICAM and elsewhere, where in fact a lot of the mediation that we're going to need can happen, and we don't need to go universal, we need to go mediate.
Okay. I think it was, is there still a comment here?
What? Yeah.
And then I'll go to the phone.
My comment keeps changing as time goes on. But there was this comment earlier that...
I'm sorry, can you identify something?
Dave Ferriol. Yes. So there's this comment earlier that said no one would ever claim that they have low assurance attributes, but I don't think that's the case. When I tried to look for one of my childhood friends, John Kenger, I got 20 possible results. And what they were basically saying, these are low assurance results. But they also provided some other information, what his sister's name was, where he lived, what addresses. And I was able to identify from his low assurance sources, I was able to identify the particular...
Yeah, I think Kim mentioned that LexisNexis will or does provide, I think she even used the word low assurance. And in fact, some providers use this as marketing. They give you low and then say, and if you're willing to pay, I'll do a better one for you, but now I need your credit card number. So that's another reason to provide low, right, to tease into higher, maybe.
But I think also the source of the attributes is also an important component of assurance. If I'm going to go to a meeting and it's classified, I have to send my clearance. I think they consider high assurance because of the stakes involved, but it's coming from an authoritative source, and they accept it. If you go to some third party and say, try and figure out base clearance, that you have to do a lot of crunching, provide a lot of confidence in the answer because of the source of where you're trying to collect those attributes. So
Steve, I'm trying to point that one attribute standing alone may have lower assurance. Combine multiple attributes, it kind of raises the overall assurance if you...
Yeah, and you could use your own...
Okay.
Okay, I'd like to go here, but you said there are people lining up on the phone? Or?
Yeah, we have one person with their hand raised, and that's Steve Brown.
One person, okay. Why don't I just...
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Sorry, go ahead, sure.
Okay. So I think the example that the previous gentleman gave was...
I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I think.
Okay. So the example that the previous gentleman gave was something I was about to give as well. And my point at a high level is that the attribute assurance is a very subjective term, right? I mean, so let us say that, we come up with 5 levels of assurance, but who is going to assign at that assurance level? If the identity provider or attribute provider is going to do it and the relying party is going to just, blindly use that assurance level, I think that's not how it's going to be in reality because, what is the visibility into the algorithm or logic that the IDP or attribute provider has used to come up with this assurance level, right? That's not going to be standardized. That's not going to be visible to the relying party. So ultimately, the relying party is the one that's going to come up with some assurance level based on the information that maybe the attribute provider can provide. And one of that such information is in the source, right? Where is the attribute coming from? And let the relying party make that call as to whether they can trust it or not.
Yes, that opinion has been expressed here, I think, that basically relying parties do their due diligence as they need with the provider, maybe totally out of band, and once they've done that and they know who you are, they just take the attribute, right? But
no, I was not.
There still may be a need that even after you've done that, you may be willing to pay more or want to pay less for a low insurance, or you have different parts of your business transactions have different needs. This is, I don't think there's a consensus yet across that, but your opinion has been expressed, I think, by several.
No, what I'm saying, sorry, so just one more point. I mean, what I was saying was that I'm not talking about a static trust model, right? I mean, I trust this provider forever kind of thing. And what I'm saying is that I think we need to incorporate in a specification or in a standard somewhere how the attribute provider can convey what are the sources for information in such a way that it makes sense to the relying party.
Okay, so that's one of the part of the metadata is the source. I think that actually may have been expressed as well. I think even OIX talks about the provenance was used, I think, by ID.me and then the source. But that's noted, I think. But that's one of the important metadata certainly is where did it come from, right? And well, sorry, I'm going down this way. Yeah, go ahead.
Consider with the light splitting the NPO. So I think a number of commenters have sort of gravitated around, maybe sort of to talk towards scope in terms of future activities. And Neil mentioned a couple of terms that were used by the Canadian government, and by the way, those terms were driven largely by the privacy laws there in terms of the ability to support different models of identification of individuals. And so they separated out the notions of validation and verification, as Neil noted. So without saying that those are the specific terms to use, I think they also relate a lot to a lot of the comments that were made, in so much as validation, as I understood it, was to essentially evaluate the veracity of an attribute. How good is an attribute? And you talk about freshness, the source, all those different things. And clearly that's a topic for a lot of discussion that's been studied here. But then the second part, which was also recently referred to, verification, is ensuring that that attribute comes from an individual or tying that to an individual. So there's the notion of an attribute on its own, and clearly name on its own is not sufficient. If you look at, as an example, the work on identity resolution is done with the national based on the LexisNexis database, right? There are bundles there. There are sets of attributes, and again, a lot of people have said you could take a collection of quote-unquote low assurance attributes, combine them together to get a high degree of assurance of identity resolution. So I think just in terms of scoping, it might be important to sort of separate out those parts. It feels like a lot of the discussion in terms of work is more around the first part of that, which is validation of attribute. But you really have to put it in the context of what that attribute is for.
So you need validation and verification.
Yeah.
So
Okay, let me continue down, then I'll cross.
I had a point.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
I would say that, in the discussions today and even earlier in the discussion, seems to me that there are different use cases for identity, registration and ID proofing.
Verification.
Verification. But then there's the identity registration use case as well, where you have two different entities who maintain information on the same person, but then you need to resolve if they are talking about the same person. Then there's, of course, the attribute-based access control, the entitlement sort of model. And then the fourth one that I heard mentioned today is the preferences or providing customized, personalized services.
Yes, that's another one.
Right?
Well, you say fourth. I mean, there are many right now. We don't even have time to, I mean, people want to talk about various others, but there are many. I mean, discounting is one that IDB talked about, a major one, right? But there are all sorts of things that may have nothing to do with identity. One example here was, are you 13? I don't care who you are. Right? I just want to know if you're 13 or 21 or whatever.
Not entitlement, but it is providing access.
Well, I think that was Ryan's argument, is that's just another form of access control. But, okay, yeah.
But the point was that...
purely a validation, not a verification. Right? That was the point.
Yeah, that was the point, yeah, that's right.
But I guess the point is, whether it's for what identity assurance means may differ based on which use case or context you're talking about. I was thinking, how you grade or quantify the assurance of an attribute.
Well, that's a good question. So, is what assurance means, does that differ, or is it how you do it that differs? I don't have the answer. I think there may be different opinions on that. That some people think there is hope to standardize what assurance means across, but in a way that anyone could use it. And there may be others, I suspect, who say you'll never succeed if you try that. I don't know. So maybe people want to comment on that.
Sorry, back to the road, an RP needs something in order to basically allow access to a service, provide some transaction, provide some data. That could be a whole range of things that encompass your need to uniquely identify them, or to get information that is related to entitlements and benefits of things of that nature. I'm just, to Josh's point and points that were made consistently, one theme is that ultimately the RP is the decider in this.
Right, yes, put it that way.
Right? So you can throw whatever chaff that you want at the RP. You can, but at the end of the road, it is going to basically say that these are the things I need to be, proven to me, asserted to me in this manner that I can do something with it.
They're making a risk decision.
They are, and to...
Let's help them make a risk
decision.
Yes,
but to the point that was made earlier, right, there is a tendency for us to basically make risk to be 1, 2, 3, 4. Somehow bundle it under there. But what you're discovering, especially with the financial sectors, which is very nuanced, it sounds like a lot of your customers as well, their risk models are very tailored to their circumstances and the business needs of that RP. So I'm sort of baffled by whether or not a generic attribute assurance model will ever work in the larger ecosystem.
Well, I think people have... There have been other opinions saying that an ordinal or quote-unquote simple assurance levels, in fact, is not helpful because RPs either don't understand it or that's not what they really need, right? That's one view. There may be still some views, I haven't heard too much of it, but some, that it can still help some RPs. And then there's the question of what do you do with it, right? But I don't think anyone's questioning that the RP is I hate the word, but the decider, right? Okay, make the ultimate decision. All the question is how can they be helped? How can digital identity be more mainstream and used and useful? And I think this is where the argument is. So I want to go back to this side because we have.
I just wanted to ask. This is the problem we're grappling with, right? Because our business with FICAM is that we're basically selling identity and attribute services to CSPs, and then the CSP is then talking to the deciderer. and the problem is with ethics, right, there's a couple different, so between us and the RP, there's several layers there. so it's challenging to know what to do. So, like say it's a requirement for verified attributes. So for something like an address, if an RP is attempting to use an address for identity resolution, the question is, what is it that they want, and how can the RP communicate in a way that they can funnel all the way down to the identity manager as to sort of what's their purpose for requesting the address and what type of address do they want. So if it's SSA or USCIS or somebody, and they have a record in their system that they're trying to match to for an individual, and that person's name and address is from 1995, they really want to match against a name and address from 1995, not the person after they got married and remarried and moved 5 times. And it's challenging because if we simply provide the current name and address, that doesn't work. If there's a way to communicate some of that through the channels, that would be useful. If there's a way to understand what verified attribute means a little more explicitly, that would be helpful.
So, I'm not in a position to speak for F6, so I will not. I know that there is probably going to be some sort of an industry day where you will have that opportunity to ask the question of them directly. So, from the perspective of the framework solutions, what we mean by verified is actually described in the document, right? It is uniquely tied to that. It is validated using some sort of data source mechanism, right? So verified is basically the end product of both the validation piece and the time of that person. So when a CSP is asserting a set of an attribute to us, what that means to us is basically you've done as an identity manager who's supporting the CSP, or the CSP who has that piece, you've done the things that are needed to make sure that that attribute is true and correct, and it belongs to that person. And that is basically, ultimately the RP is making a decision based on that, right? So one of the interesting caveats that doesn't seem to have come up here is there's a lot of technologies around the table, and we love to solve this on a technology basis, but ultimately, the liability issues are very critical in this. If you are asserting an attribute, wherever it is sourced from, and an RP is making a decision on it, if the thing goes wrong, who's on the hook? If it is not, you can make an easy case, by the way, for identity, but for entitlement authorization, who's on the hook?
Okay, so if I can turn to either Dave or Ryan, because Ryan actually addressed liability and was very careful, I believe, to say clearly, all we tell you is what we gave you is what we got, but whether it has anything to do with the truth, I think he was saying, we don't tell you. So maybe you can address, or Dave address, how do you handle that question, Ryan?
I was going to address it. Okay. First of all, you get a sense of 18 months of discussion on business, legal, technical, privacy, audit, certification, what we did at OAX. If you're interested in that, this is all, what Kim described was in the context of all the technical frameworks and privacy and audit and everything. A couple things. One, when you go to sources of data that are commercially available online today, and, we're a reseller for these folks, when we commonly get the question, we want multiple sources so we can waterfall. We want to check with one, if that fails, check with another. So they're not, even from commercially available sources, they're not comfortable with just one source. And that's just their choice, right? They may choose 3, and they may choose device IDs, and all kinds of things that they'll layer in there to get comfortable with their assurance associated with this attribute. The second piece is there is no assurance in terms of contracts for guaranteeing the quality of the data. Contractually, none of these folks will guarantee that name and address, telephone are accurate. And the reason that is because there's just too much liability, and they're derived data sources. Remember, one of the sources was derived. So they're taking from a lot of different sources of data, they're scoring it, and they're saying, this is what we think it is, here it is, do what you want with it, right? And that's what you're buying. So, this question of assurance of attributes is an economic issue, it's a risk issue, it's a usability issue, it's a lot of issues that are complex that, one RP has got to filter between cost, risk, usability, or user experience associated with that, and the other factors that are associated with privacy and things like that that go into it. So it's a much more complex issue than just saying attribute assurance is scoreable. because of us instead of my dynamic.
Okay.
And I agree with what you're saying.
I think if I take anything out of this, it's complex. I'm cognizant of the time. We have 5 minutes. I'd like to just take a little stock of who wants some last comments right now. There was one here. Anyone behind me? No?
Yeah, 30 seconds.
Okay, one here. And
Jim over there.
so 3 or 4. Anyone on the phone?
I know we had a question on the phone, but,
Okay. So if I can ask, we'll go through, can you all keep to a minute or less, please? We only have, okay, go ahead first.
When you replace the user in the diagram with the machine, a lot of the discussion, a lot of the problems, a lot of the work to be done is the same. There are also some uniquenesses. So when you think about topics for a future workshop, exploring what those uniquenesses are and making conscious decisions about
We've been thinking about machine-to-machine or non-person entity.
Okay, yeah, you have the non-person entity, but yes, so I've noted that that should be included. That, indeed, that wasn't really addressed explicitly so much. Okay, I'm sorry, next was Jim.
Hi, Jim Fenton. So this has been great, and I really hope that the slides are going to show up online somewhere. I trust they will. I couldn't read them all.
We'll get to that at the end, yeah.
Great. One of the things that I couldn't read was what, all of the different pieces of an attribute might be. And somebody mentioned earlier the need to support business models for attribute providers. And one of the things that we might consider is terms of use associated with the attribute. Is it allowed to be distributed and so forth? Or, as in the case of a credit bureau, is it intended for the use of a single relying party? So that might be something to explore as well. If it hasn't already been, it might be there.
Okay. That's pretty well defined contractually today.
Yeah, but we need a way of conveying it in the protocol, that's what.
Right. You're right. That wasn't really discussed so much. It was a lot on what does the relying party need, not so much about maybe the user controlling what the relying party is allowed or permitted to do and how is that enforced. Okay, behind me, yes, sir.
Jamie Clark from Oasis. Real quick thought for you on the policy background for this. I think it was Anil who came up with attributes of the new money earlier today, or attributes of the new black. And we have other fine old established friends of the community here who told us a while ago that an identity is just a name with a bag of attributes below it. If those are true, then that means all of the policy issues we have with identity all read on manipulation of attributes. So in addition to some of this good technical stuff and market brokering stuff we've been talking about, basically that means that all the things we were talking about as policy imperatives that read on identity transactions read specifically on attribute transactions. I just wanted to put that out there so we don't forget it. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. And there was one down here. Wait, no. Anil again? All right.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
I just wanted to give a funny, I stopped a guy on the street yesterday with his 2 children, and I said, hi, I'm in the business of protecting your child's identity online and managing consent. How would you go about... Stop. This is really interesting. I said to him, how would you go about proving to me that these are your children? He goes, what are you talking about? Look at them. Genetics. And that was in his... And I said, no, but online. How would you do that online? And
well, maybe DNA is the answer. I don't know.
Okay.
All right, sorry. There was one on the phone, and then we need to wrap up, I think.
Yeah, Bob Barron on the phone. Bob, you can go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I think, Jamie, you were getting to the point that I've been online chatting about, and that is that I think every player within the chain of user to RP, including all the intermediaries, need to understand what the standards for attribute assertion and attribute verification and attribute validation are, so that the ultimate resolution of identity can match the risks and liabilities of everybody in the chain. Because if we rely simply upon the RP, then we'll never necessarily have an ecosystem, because the RPs will maintain their own standards of identity and confuse the identity processing with their own business case, which could be understandable. And that would mean that we would never have, because Anil and I have had this conversation. In regard to the various federal users, there's one thing to have an identity proofing process and not confuse the business case. But F6 will never work if every agency says, but no, I need to even be more assured that the driver's license was issued properly and that the issuer had the right to issue it and the card is not fraudulent. And so in the online context, if I'm using, you know, KBA or some other basis for asserting identity, I need as an RP to be as assured as I can. And I think that's the function of the ecosystem and the federation is to provide a standard that each of the parties can reach to and then back off if we don't need, you know, I want to say level 4, but if we don't need high, if we only need anonymous or pseudonymous, then back off and establish standards at those realms too. That's all I want to say.
Okay, so thank you. So plead for standards, I believe. Okay, I want to wrap up and honor your time. Certainly you're welcome to, I guess, stick around the building. I don't know if you'll be kicked out to talk further if you wish. So what's next? So I know IDSG will look into how best to progress this, since there seems to be a lot of interest. There currently is an ad hoc work group within the Security Committee that may or may not continue. I don't know the answers. It's not up to me. But that will go forward one way or another, and we'll see where that goes. NIST, I believe, will use the feedback here to decide whether, or maybe they've already decided, and how to organize a workshop, and it may or may not lead to a special publication, but this, again, is nothing to do with me. Do you want to say anything about that now or not?
No, Dave, I don't know if you want to talk on that a little bit.
Well, it's not time for a talk, but okay. But anyway, you'll hear about that. That'll be publicized. And then if I could ask, the slides, information about this meeting, future will be on the wiki, the website. Maybe you could say a little about where people can find these things?
Yeah, all of the recordings and all of the presentations for the last 3 days will be found on the 9th plenary page on the website. It may take a couple of days for us to get everything up. All be up tomorrow morning, but just be on the lookout for it, and it should all go up fairly soon.
And I'd like to say thank you to all our presenters and everyone who participated very much. Thank you very much.
How did you realize?